All right, I'm going to cut any kind of rambling introduction here and just get right to the point. My purpose here is to articulate the criteria by which a game can be judged to be a role-playing game, or more specifically, to what degree it is one, sliding scale and all that. This isn't something that hasn't been laid out before, but it's worth laying out here just so any future discussions I have about games that are considered RPGs are working off of a solid definition of that phrase, since it can quickly become confusing once non-RPG elements start getting mixed in. To be clear, the degree to which a game is an RPG has no bearing on its merit as a game whatsoever. Only RPG fans will demerit something they expect or wish to be an RPG for lacking in such a quality, but it is useful when discussing the effect RPG mechanics have on how a game plays and in tracking changes in game design over time. Playing a character, to be very clear, is not what makes a game an RPG. Else, any game where the player character is narratively constructed, i.e., is not literally just a player avatar, is an RPG, which would make a huge percentage of games RPGs, making the term redundant. RPG fans can screech against RPGs that don't permit them flexibility in narrative choice all they want. Being able to act good or evil or choose a narrative branch is not what makes an RPG. You are role playing in such instances, but the term role playing game is misleading in that respect. Narrative role playing, as in acting as a character in the game world, is not what people are referring to when they talk about RPGs, regardless of how much some may insist that it is. Until Dawn is full of narrative choice, but it's not an RPG. You can choose to be an asshole in a Telltale game, but that isn't an RPG either. RPGs do involve role playing, but of a different sort. The conflation of the two types causes the confusion. I've said before that RPGs exist on a sliding scale, so saying a game is an RPG is inherently oversimplified. It's better for definitional purposes to define what an RPG mechanic is, then we can say a game is more or less of an RPG by how much its gameplay systems are dominated by RPG mechanics. So, to wit, an RPG mechanic is a game mechanic wherein a player character's aptitude is determined by an abstracted calculation rather than direct player input. Consider firing a gun at a target. In a shooter, whether the player character hits that target is determined by the player's skill at manipulating the game's controls to place their point of aim over the target, keep it on target, and control the gun's recoil so as not to miss when firing. Hitting the target is a matter of skill on the player's part in aiming and firing the gun. As an RPG mechanic, firing a gun would not be a matter of the player themselves manipulating a control input to aim and fire the weapon, but an abstracted measure of their character's skill at doing so. RPG mechanics decouple the player's aptitude from the character's. It doesn't matter if the player would be able to headshot every enemy in an encounter if allowed to aim the gun themselves. What the game cares about is how skilled their character is at doing so. It is not in the player's power to enhance the character's aptitude with their own direct input, as that skill has been abstracted into a calculation. The character's skill at using guns is represented by a series of numerical values such as damage and accuracy, and the effect of firing the gun is determined by calculations involving those values, not player input. The game would, for instance, determine whether the player hits the target using an RNG weighted using an accuracy rating. Higher accuracy means a greater chance to hit. The player's own hypothetical skill at aiming guns in a game is irrelevant here. Indeed, it cannot manifest at all, as a pure RPG would not facilitate the player even being able to perform such an input. This sort of number crunching focus is a result of RPGs spawning from wargaming. In a war game, the player controls an entire side of a battle, not any one particular character. They play any number of roles in the game, depending on what variety of units they have at their disposal, and all at the same time. In a pure RPG, which can't truly exist, to be clear, since otherwise it would not be a game, player input and thus influence on events is required. The player controls only one character. Thus, they are mechanically role-playing, as in they are locked into using a particular character with a particular set of numerical aptitude values, your stats, as they're usually called. You may already see this means there can be a spectrum between RPGs and war games, depending on how specific the player's control is, but it exists largely in theory. In practice, they remain distinct owing to wargaming being quite niche and the middle ground between the two being little explored. Most players would rather control either the entire side of a fight or one member, rather than some middling percentage of it. It does mean, however, that single-player video RPGs can be said to blur the line a bit. The player has their player character to control in these games, but also controls the entire adventuring party. What ends up differentiating this, and in truth most RPGs, from wargaming is scale and context, not anything mechanical. The adventuring party is usually quite small, single-digit numbers of characters rather than dozens or hundreds, and many of the things they do may be non-combat related, as opposed to wargaming's singular focus on martial combat. The RPG is, in essence, a personalization and generalization of the wargame. A personalization of wargaming mechanics to an individual and individualized player character, and a generalization of wargaming mechanics to any potential attribute, not just combat statistics. This is the core of what an RPG is. RPGs have become associated with other mechanics, such as choose your own adventure storytelling, narrative role-playing, and skill progression, but those are not necessary for something to be an RPG. A pure kill and loot dungeon crawl is still an RPG if it is done by a cast of player characters who each exhibit numerically abstracted skills. This, then, is the basis on which we can judge something to be more or less of an RPG. As the progenitor, Dungeons & Dragons is the closest one can get to a pure RPG that's still fun to play or play at all. Its gameplay mechanics are entirely abstracted, though I admit resolving sword duels in a tabletop game via an IRL fencing match would be pretty amusing. Something like Elden Ring is what I'd call a half RPG. The player character's attack power, defense power, and ability to equip and use items and abilities is limited by their character stats, but this ends up serving as a difficulty modifier on the actual combat mechanics, which demands a higher and higher level of player skill the lower one's stats are, but nevertheless does allow the player to compensate for their character's weakness with their own mechanical skill and win fights that, were the fight a pure number crunch, they would have no chance of ever winning, and, by contrast, lose fights they statistically shouldn't if they're sufficiently inept at the combat mechanics. And as the complete opposite, a game like Call of Duty is not an RPG at all. Every player character is statistically identical at base, only being modified by equipment the player chooses to equip, and the character's aptitude with that equipment is entirely reliant on the player's skill at the game. If your aim sucks, your character's aim sucks, because your aim is their aim. As a final point, I just want to comment on the game I'm currently playing, Fallout 4, as an example of a middling case. The player's special stats directly determine their base attributes, and thus impact the player's ability to use VATS efficiently, tank hits, persuade other characters, etc. They also determine what perks you're allowed to invest into, meaning your character build is constrained by what perks your special stats allow you to access, which is very RPG. However, most of the game's mechanics are completely accessible and perfectly serviceable no matter what perks you have. Every player can aim and fire every weapon entirely with their own shooting skills. Only character inherent damage, based on weapon type, is perk locked. Every player can engage in settlement building, as the vast majority of what you can build is not perk locked. Every player can use power armor, only crafting upgrades is perk locked. Every player can scrounge for materials, only what you build with them is perk locked, mostly equipment upgrades. In short, while the game has RPG mechanics, they are ultimately supplemental. There are only a few mechanics that you are totally or mostly locked out of without perk and thus special investment: lockpicking, hacking, persuasion, and most non-settlement crafting, to be precise. None of these drastically change the way you play the game, even if you will notice having versus not having them. I would thus call Fallout 4 a primarily action adventure, or I guess on survival mode you could call it action survival game with RPG elements. They are decidedly in a minority position in importance. Hopefully, this clears the matter up in any future discussions I have regarding such mechanics.